because of the current restrictions, we're really, there's a little bit of leniency for time. So don't worry about that. Just send in your questions, send in your inquiries. Registration should be live by next week on our website, and scholarships will also be live, hopefully, Lord willing, by next week as well. Okay, guys, so it is without further ado that I have the pleasure of introducing, actually from Canada here in North America, a friend of ours, Charlotte Korchak, who we had the pleasure, I had the pleasure of actually getting to know her 5 years ago, I believe was our first meeting, Charlotte. And, you know, we've been working with Stand With Us kind of together. I had a relationship with Stand With Us even before my time at the ICEJ. Like we had like the former director on our ICJ TV program. And that was where the connection kind of went. I'm going to let Charlotte share a little bit more of what Stand With Us does. But basically, they are like the forefront young adult Israeli and like diaspora Jewish organization standing in advocacy for Israel, standing against anti-Semitism, giving the truth of the matter, what's happening there on the ground in the Holy Land. And Charlotte is a senior educator. She's probably one of the best speakers that I know of in the Christian and Jewish world. So she can really get the point through. And so it is my honor to introduce Charlotte. Now, Charlotte is from an Orthodox Jewish background. So she's going to come with a really cool perspective for all of us that maybe we wouldn't be hearing normally in our kind of evangelical Christian circles. So Charlotte, without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to you. I'm going to make sure that you're unmuted so you can speak and kind of give us an update of what is happening in Israel with its neighbors and with COVID-19.
Sure. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much. First of all, I have to say something. So when Philippe was introducing the trip, you said like, COVID permitted, we'll go in August. And here I am as an Israeli, and I'm thinking, wow, what a different reality. You know, a few years ago, it was always, as long as there's not a war, we'll go to Israel. And now it's like such a shift in mentality, as Israel hasn't been in a real conflict or real war since 2014. So now it's like pandemic permitting rather than war permitting, which is just a very interesting shift that it just kind of hit me when you were saying that. So just wanted to share like the real incredible change of reality that Israel has gone through in the last 10 years. So before I dive in, let me just quickly introduce myself a little bit further so y'all know who you're hearing from. So my name is Charlotte Korchak. I am originally from, as you can tell from my lack of accent, I'm originally from the United States. That's actually where I am right now. I'm in Florida, flew in this morning to Florida from Los Angeles. But originally I'm from Los Angeles. That's where I lived until I was 9 years old. But when I was 9, my parents decided to really uproot, I would say, me and my 4 older siblings, and they moved us to the land of Israel. Not necessarily the state of Israel, as my family decided to move to a Jewish settlement in Judea and Samaria in the West Bank. So if I say on campuses today that I moved to Israel, sometimes I get yelled at like, that's not Israel, that's Palestine, or that's the West Bank, or that's occupied territory, whatever it is. So that's my life, already diving into some complexity and the controversy that revolves around this country. But I lived in a settlement for a year. And after a year of realizing that small towns were really not for me or my family decided to find the biggest city in Israel, which is of course Jerusalem. And we moved there and we lived there for 4 more years. And it was during our time in Jerusalem that really I came face to face with the conflict for the first time. And it wasn't, you know, something that I encountered, you know, in a classroom or in a book that I was reading, but I encountered it in real life. You know, at the time, there was a huge wave of terrorism that struck Israel. It started when I just turned 13. And so my last 2 years in Israel was years of terror and violence. I lived in Jerusalem. It was one of the hardest hit cities. We suffered over 600 terrorist attacks in our city. And so the bus that I took to school was blown up. Literally, I missed it by about 10 minutes. 3 of my friends, unfortunately, when I was 14 years old, went out to eat pizza one Saturday night and never made it home because a suicide bomber blew himself up, killing 3 of them and injuring many more. So my introduction was a very personal one. I didn't learn about this again in a classroom. It didn't come from an academic place. It came from I'm living this, I'm experiencing this, and now I have skin in the game because I've lost friends and loved ones in this process. And I was a child, so my perspective was very narrow, very one-sided, very hateful to a certain extent. And then I moved back to the United States with my family, unfortunately, because the economy in Israel had crashed. So I moved from Jerusalem to Las Vegas, which is like super weird, right? The holy city to the city of sin. And I found myself in a very different environment in the United States, kind of leaving the conflict behind. And I won't really encounter the conflict again until I get to university. I made my way around the United States from Las Vegas to Maryland and then back to California, where I found myself at university. And it was in my first year at university that I came face to face again with anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, this rhetoric that we hear, the delegitimization of Israel, you know, the demonization of Israel, calling Israel an apartheid country, that Zionism, this thing that I so very deeply believe in, was racism, apparently. And I didn't really know how to respond or how to react. I was never trained in that kind of reaction. And I really didn't know much about the conflict to begin with. It was just personal and experiential. So I went on a journey that you could say I've been on now for 15 years. And I never stopped kind of diving and learning and trying to understand this conflict, not from that, you know, deeply personal place, but really from an academic place, from a place of what is the full story? What is the history? What is this full picture? So that's just a little bit about me and my background. 8 years ago, I had the amazing opportunity to move back to Israel. And then so I've been living in the holy city of Jerusalem ever since. So that's me, that's my story. So let's dive into this topic. Enough about me. Let's talk about, you know, what's going on in Israel today. And I want to start with probably the best thing that's happened in the last 10 years, which is, of course, the fact that Israel and these Arab countries have now normalized relations and made peace, right? The Abraham Accords have emerged. And so I want to start there. You know, we had this amazing moment through the pandemic where these Arab countries started to really warm their relations with Israel. And it reached a point where starting in August, we started to hear talks of normalization and peace, first with the United Arab Emirates, and then Bahrain joined in, and we were already excited. And then a month later, Sudan said that they were going to join. And then a few months later, Morocco said, you know what, we're going to jump on the bandwagon as well. And, you know, as much as some people have tried to paint this as negative, I just don't understand how they're doing that. I don't know how anyone could paint peace as a negative, but somehow when it comes to Israel, everything can turn negative, apparently. But let's try to understand really quickly why this happened, right? I think a lot of people, unfortunately, look at the normalization from a negative. They look at kind of the history of what's gone on in the Middle East, specifically with the growing Iranian threat in the Middle East that really has emerged since, could really go back to like 2003, the fall of Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein really kind of like kept Iran in check for a long time after, you know, he defeated them in the Iran-Iraq war. And so with him losing power in 2003, they started to see this opportunity to gain power in the Middle East. And then you had the Arab Spring. And the Arab Sunni world was being destabilized. And there was again, more of an opportunity for Iran to start spreading their power. And then you had Barack Obama in the United States, who very much wanted to bring Iran into the fold. And to do that, what he did is he signed a deal with Iran. He said, we want Iran to stop developing nuclear weapons, but we want them to be able to still develop nuclear power, still stop being a malign actor in the Middle East and join the community of peaceful countries. He was an idealist. And unfortunately, as much as it was a good idea, he signed a deal with the devil. This was a country that probably lied straight to his face and had no real intention of staying in the deal. And really, from almost the moment that it was signed, we already started to hear that maybe Iran wasn't being compliant with this deal. And so this is really what people focus on, that with Iran and with everything that happened in Iran's growing power, the Arab Sunni world, led by Saudi Arabia, but these other Sunni countries, really were looking for allies because of this growing Iranian threat. And they found Israel, right? Because Israel is also an enemy of Iran, but not that they're an enemy of Israel, right? The reverse, right? They have decided that Israel's their enemy, right? Since 1979 and the revolution in Iran. And so it's a negative way of looking at it, right? That they were pushed into Israel's arms because of this growing threat from Iran. Now, it's true, but there's a much more positive thing that's also taking place that we should note, because a lot of people will ask me, well, if Iran is no longer a threat, will these countries just turn their back on Israel, right? And the answer, I think, is no. You know, when the Abraham Accords were signed, they kept calling them a peace agreement. You ever notice this? And me as a historian, I'm sitting there going, why are we calling these peace agreements? We've never been at war with these countries. None of them, in fact. The only country that maybe you could argue we had some role would be Sudan, who played a very minor role in the War of Independence, sending aid and such to the Arab countries, to the Arab armies. But that was it. So why are we calling these peace accords? And then as time went on, I started to understand why. Because, back in 1979, and then in 1994, we signed peace with Egypt and with Jordan. And we called them peace because, well, that made sense. We were at war with Egypt and Jordan. We had fought multiple wars with these countries. So, of course, it makes sense to call these peace agreements, but we didn't really get real peace. What we got was actually peace between the governments. You had some diplomatic relations, you had some economic relations, but peace between the people was not even attempted. The Egyptians signed the deal, but they didn't start to, teach their children that Israelis are good or Jews aren't bad. They continued to incite against Israelis and against the Jewish people. Today, what we're seeing with these other countries is it's not just we're trying to build a relationship with the government of Israel, but we want to see real peace on the ground between the peoples. And so after signing these agreements, what we see has happened is, over 100,000 Israelis have already traveled to Dubai, to the UAE in the last few months. And what the Emiratis were talking about was, we don't just want to make peace with the government. We want real peace between the people. We want Israelis to travel to the UAE. We want Emiratis to be able to travel to Israel. And we already see direct flights taking place between the two countries. And so it's a real peace that many would argue that if time goes on and the regime changes in either country, that the peace will hold. Okay. And that was the fear of the Egyptian peace, for example. When after the fall of Mubarak, there was an election in Egypt, and who emerged was Mohammed Morsi, who was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, who were very anti-Israel. And there was an immense fear of what's going to happen with this relationship. Is it going to be able to survive this change in power? Because there is no peace between the people. So again, when we look at the Abraham Accords, we should see it as an outright positive, because this slowly but surely is planting the seeds of peace throughout the Middle East. And that is incredibly important, because so let's also go into the positive: peace between the people, but also they're getting something out of this. It's a mutually beneficial deal. Now let's understand something else that's happening in the Middle East. Arab populations are growing exponentially in the Middle East. We're seeing children being born, and the elderly are not yet dying out, to the point that these populations have expanded doublefold and now triplefold in the last 50 years. And the younger generation of Arabs is so detached from the Arab-Israeli conflict, right? Think about it. In 2002, the Arab Peace Initiative emerged out of the Arab League, which basically said, okay, you know what? Israel's here to stay. They didn't actually say that, but what did they say? Before that time period, what was the Arab policy? Arab rejectionism. Israel should not exist. We're not going to accept Israel's existence. We're going to keep trying to destroy Israel, right? We saw it in 1948. We saw it again in 1967. We saw it again in 1973. And after 1967, they signed a deal in Khartoum. They signed an agreement that said, a resolution, that said, no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. And that was their policy. And then comes 2002, and they just wipe it away. And they say, listen, we can make peace with Israel, and we can normalize relations with Israel, which is basically de facto them accepting that we are in existence, that we're here to stay. But peace with the Palestinians has to come first. That was the paradigm created by the Arab League in 2002. And then things started, what happened? Well, 18 years have gone by. There's been a lot of negotiations with the Palestinians, and every time they said no. And these countries that are hurting economically because of these expanding populations are realizing that having an economic relationship with Israel, having trade with Israel, having Israeli technology, like agricultural technology, water technology, come to these countries will benefit them, benefit their economy, and help them with this growing challenge of a shrinking job market and a younger generation that is detached. They're sitting there going, we don't remember war with Israel. When was the last time an Arab country fought a war with Israel? It was 1973. So they're sitting there going, why should I care about this? Why should I be invested? Why should I hate this country? And again, because of the shift in rhetoric in the last 20 years, in the last 10 years of Iran's now the threat, not Israel, right? It used to be Israeli aggression. Look at Israel and how they're treating the Palestinians. Now it's Iran, Iran, Iran. So even more so, the younger generation, when polled, they're saying Israel, Palestinian, like that's like 7th on my list of things that I'm concerned about right now, right? I'm concerned about quality of life. I'm concerned about cost of living. I'm concerned about having a job when I graduate from college. And so a lot's happening that even if the Iranian threat is quelled and quieted, there's a lot of belief that these peace and normalization deals will hold and will bring us into a new Middle East. Now, let's talk about Iran really fast. Iran is a growing threat. And with the new Biden administration, we're seeing obviously a different approach to Iran. The approach is not the Trump approach, which was sanction and isolate. Okay, we're not going to talk to you. We have no communication with you. We're isolating you. We're sanctioning you just to hurt you to the point that hopefully you won't be able to develop nuclear weapons. The Biden approach is different. The Biden approach is, maybe we'll talk to you. Maybe we'll rejoin the deal. But this is the rhetoric that we've heard so far. We, the Americans, will rejoin the Iran deal when you, the Iranians, come back to full compliance with the Iran deal. Now, let's understand, the Iranians have very clearly said, we're not returning to full compliance. What actually should be mind-boggling is why the other countries that signed the Iran deal are still in the Iran deal, when Iran is now blatantly violating the deal, and they still are sticking around, which basically sends the message that you can. So what is Iran doing right now? Iran is actually turning to the European countries and saying, you guys got to help us, help get the Americans back into the deal, help get the Americans to remove sanctions before we, the Iranians, have to do anything. Now, the hope is that the rhetoric coming out of the Biden administration remains true, that they say, no matter what, we are not going to alleviate sanctions until you return to full compliance. Why is this a big deal? Because they're not going to return to full compliance, which means that American sanctions will remain under the Biden administration. So Iran remains a growing threat. And at the moment, I don't know if you've been following the headlines just in the last few days, but a lot of people are coming out saying that if nothing changes, Iran is on their way to getting the nuclear material that they need to have a nuclear weapon. I don't even know what to call him right now. He was meant to be acting prime minister. Benny Gantz, who's one of the leaders in Israel, who used to be the chief of staff of the IDF, has said, and this has kind of been the rhetoric of Israel since the beginning of the Iranian threat, that if they need to go in and militarily harm Iran to prevent them from nuclear breakout, they will. So it's something to watch very, very closely. It's literally day to day things are changing when it comes to Iran, and we don't really know how it's going to play out. What I do know is that the Middle East that Biden is stepping into is remarkably different from the Middle East that Obama left 4 years ago. And if he was to fully return to the Iran deal without Iran doing anything, he would lose not only Israel, but he would lose the Arab Sunni world, who are also very much being threatened by the Iranians. So that's Iran. That's the Abraham Accords. Let's put that aside and let's dive now into the Israelis and the Palestinians. I said that the 2002 peace initiative established a paradigm. Peace with the Palestinians first, and then normalize relations with Israel. Well, clearly that paradigm has now shifted. And the Palestinians lost it, by the way. When the Abraham Accords were coming about and we were talking about it, the Palestinians immediately went to the Arab League and said, you got to condemn them. You got to condemn the UAE. You got to condemn Bahrain. They're not allowed to do this. This is violating the peace initiative. We come first. And the Arab League said no. And the Palestinians felt abandoned. Who is here to help us? And they feel more abandoned because aid that was flowing into the Palestinian Authority over the years from Arab countries has become less and less and less over the years. So they're struggling economically. And so they feel very backed into a corner. Now, what is going to happen with peace with the Palestinians? I don't know. What I can tell you about the Biden administration is, one, I don't even think it's on their agenda. Why is it not on their agenda? They literally have not. Biden has yet to pick up the phone and call Bibi Netanyahu. Okay? He's spoken to Mexico, Germany, the Russians, the Canadians. We have not been on that list. And a lot of people might be like, that's such a, how dare he? And I'm sitting here going, honestly, if that's a sign that we're going to be low down on his agenda, totally fine with that. What is he saying? What is his agenda? a two-state solution. Okay, that's been the policy of the United States for decades. And he said, we're going to push for two states, and we are going to push that neither side does anything unilaterally. So Israel, minimize your settlement building. Palestinians, stop inciting violence. This sounds very familiar because, again, this was American policy for decades. And if it stays that way, meh, a lot of Israelis might look at it going, we're status quoers too. We don't think that much can change because Palestinian leadership hasn't changed since the Palestinian Authority was created in 1993-94, right? You had Yasser Arafat, who was the president of the PA and the chairman of the PLO from 1994-5, at least the PLO for longer, sorry, complicated, PLO since 68, and then PA since 95 when he was officially elected. And then he died in 2004, and Mahmoud Abbas, basically his disciple, takes over, and we've had basically the same sort of leadership ever since the founding of the PA for the last 25 years. So Israelis sit there and go, what's going to change? Even if we go back to negotiate with Mahmoud Abbas, what more can we offer than what we offered him in 2000 in the Camp David Agreement or in 2008 with the Olmert Agreement? Okay, so if you want to put us at the bottom of the list, don't make us a priority, maybe that's a good thing because nothing's changing right now. Oh, but wait a second. Maybe something is changing. Two things. One, there's a big question. Who are the Palestinians going to align themselves with? Are they going to take the offer made by the Arab world, which is the Emiratis who came to them and said, look, we're not hanging you out to dry. We're not abandoning you. Here's the thing. We're worrying about ourselves first. We need to protect ourselves from Iran. We have other economic issues and we need Israel. And so you're not gonna be the thing that's gonna stop us from doing that. But now that we have a relationship with Israel, we can use that as leverage to help with negotiations. So the question is, are the Palestinians gonna kind of accept that and look to the Arab world and get on planes and go to the UAE and go to Bahrain and go to Sudan and even go to Saudi Arabia and say, Yalla, you're making now have this relationship with Israel and then push for us too? Or are they gonna align themselves with the more malign actors in the Middle East? Iran, Turkey, Qatar, which is kind of in this weird place right now as they're trying to warm their relations back up with countries like Saudi Arabia and the more moderate Sunni world because they kind of were ousted because they were supporting terrorism, they were supporting violence, and these were countries that at that time were moving in a different direction. So who knows? Which direction are they going to go? I'll tell you one thing. The one place that Mahmoud Abbas has flown in the last few months is Qatar. Maybe that tells you where his head is, what he's thinking. The other big shift is the Palestinians are going to have an election. Maybe. Hopefully, not too sure. The Palestinians in the last 15 years, the last election that they had for president was in 2005, January of 2005, and for parliament was in January of 2006. So it's been 15 years. And right now, Mahmoud Abbas has come out and said, you know what, we're actually going to have an election. Now, let me be clear. In the last 15 years, they've said this a lot. This sounds like the most serious that it might actually happen. But even if it does, who is going to run in this election? Hamas, who is the terrorist organization that controls the Gaza Strip, that is the outright rival of Mahmoud Abbas. Fatah, Mahmoud Abbas's party. Okay, those are the two that we expect. There's another person who threw his name into the hat that you should know. His name is Mohammed Dahlan. Mohammed Dahlan is a Palestinian from Gaza who was exiled back in 2011 or 10 to Abu Dhabi. And he's been living in the UAE ever since as a businessman. And he actually, people, attribute him to kind of pushing the UAE to kind of make this deal with Israel. And he is despised by Mahmoud Abbas because he's giving him a run for his money. He is getting followers in the West Bank. Why? He's running on a different platform. He's reaching out to people from an economic standpoint, from a place of we need change and we need difference and we need somebody who's going to focus on our future. Mahmoud Abbas has already now come out and said Dahlan is not going to be allowed to run in this next election. Mahmoud Abbas already said, regardless of the election, I'm still going to be in power. That's what he said. So what does the election really mean? Probably not much. And if anything, it could just cause more chaos in the West Bank and Gaza. But the reality is we can have an election and Mahmoud Abbas might just win yet again. I'll tell you one thing about the Palestinians that is interesting that you see in polls. When Palestinians are polled and asked, what is your driving factor when it comes to elections? Why do you vote for somebody? Here's how things are ranked. Top of the list, resistance against Israel. If you can show that you have been, and they call it resistance, I'm going to call it terrorism. If you can show that you have conducted terrorist acts or have been part of the resistance against Israel, top of the list. Second is, are you an Islamist? Okay. How important is Islam to you? Okay. And third on the list is nation building. So as much as Dahlan at this moment is gaining popularity, as long as that is still the paradigm amongst the Palestinians in terms of how they vote, chances are Fatah could be elected, and even Hamas, like in 2006, could win a majority. So who knows? According to polls, Fatah is usually low down on the list. Okay, actually, funny enough, when polls are taken, they usually poll Fatah, Hamas, and one other person. That other person is a guy named Marwan Barghouti. Marwan Barghouti has been sitting in Israeli jails since 2004, 3, something like that. He was the architect of the Second Intifada. He has blood of hundreds of people on his hands. And when polled, Hamas, Fatah, Marwan Barghouti would win. But again, he is still a prisoner in Israeli jails for killing Israelis. So it doesn't look good, okay? We're going to see. But again, if we stick with the old guard, if you ask most Israelis, they would say nothing's going to change. Nothing's going to change. Now, I want to stress something else. I'm putting it a lot on the Palestinians. Let's also acknowledge that Israel has a lot of domestic issues. Tons of domestic issues. As I'm sure you all know, Israel is now going into its 4th election in 2 years. It is a joke. It's sad. It's very hard. I love that Adam's laughing. You should. And then it should be a little sad at the same time, right? Because we are defunct at this moment. And I don't know how we're going to pull out of it. What that means is that in Israel, we haven't had a functioning government in 2 years. Israel has not passed a budget in 2 years. There are government offices that are functioning and they have no idea how much money they are allowed to spend, but they're spending money. We are going into another election and it looks, according to polls, like nothing really much is going to change, except for one interesting factor that I just want to throw in as a total tangent. The Arab Israeli population is something's interesting is happening. So the Arab leadership in our government, the Arab parties, there are 3 Arab parties that merged, actually 4 because 2 of them had merged before and then the 3 of those came together. But they were very much against the Abraham Accords. They spoke out against the Abraham Accords. And so Adam's saying they're starting to like Bibi. Well, I don't know if they're starting to like Bibi so much as they're actually starting to just not like their parties, the political parties, because they turned against the Abraham Accords. Now, why? Well, if you actually look at the numbers, I said 120,000 Israelis have gone to Dubai. A lot of them have been Arab Israelis. And they so appreciate the fact that now there is a place that they can go and speak their language and involve themselves in their similar culture somewhere else and not be seen as traitors. Because Arab Israelis historically in the Arab world were seen as traitors to their people. And so they've turned against their Arab leadership, and the Arab party in the government has lost 20% of its constituency as a result of this. So we're seeing very interesting shifts. And the real question then is, where is that 20% going to go? And that's where, when Adam said they're starting to love Bibi, I don't know if that's the case, but Bibi is lobbying them to try to get them to love him. No doubt about it. And the funny part is actually that a lot of some Arab Israelis in the past have actually voted for Bibi, have voted for Likud, and even have voted further to the right for religious reasons, because they appreciate the religious parties and how they emphasize religion in the country. Which is a really interesting factor. Yamina would be one example, Adam. Even further to the right, even like United Torah Judaism, or Shas. Shas being the Middle Eastern Jewish Orthodox party in the government, as we call them, Mizrahi or Sephardi. Exactly. So it's really interesting, okay? But the reality also is, if we look at peace with the Palestinians, our government has been shifting more and more to the right in terms of the coalitions that have been able to be built. And our left-wing parties are shrinking. And so even though I say, are the Palestinians ready for peace? If, elections happen, but we stay with the same leadership, can we really make peace? I'm asking that on the Palestinian side, but I'm also asking it on the Israeli side. Is the Israeli government in a position where they really want to make sacrifices or make concessions for peace? And I think the answer that most Israelis would give you is absolutely not right now. Now let's wrap up with COVID. Whew. Because COVID has really, I mean, I've joked, you know, we talk about Israeli domestic issues, but for so long, Israeli domestic issues were shoved to the side because it was like, well, there's an existential threat. These people are trying to kill us, or these people are trying to kill us. So like all that stuff just doesn't matter anymore. And then came the pandemic, and we didn't have that. The existential threats weren't there. And I would even argue today there aren't really existential threats. When Iran gets a nuclear weapon, maybe, but the existential threat thing has kind of dissipated. We're a very strong country at this point, and we know how to protect ourselves. But threats unite us. Well, there wasn't a threat. The threat was COVID. And what it did was ultimately was it brought so much of our domestic issues to the surface. The issues with the ultra-Orthodox in Israel, a community that has never really listened to the government. The issues with the Arab Israelis in the country. Arab-Israeli violence within their own communities has increased dramatically lately. And this is now an ongoing issue within their own community. You see Arab Israelis, just like the ultra-Orthodox, very communal people who were also ignoring COVID restrictions because they thought, well, I want to go meet with my family, right? You have the far left who are so against Bibi Netanyahu, so they're out protesting every day. But again, COVID, so all of our domestic issues kind of bubble to the surface. Now, once the conversation about a vaccine was emerging, Bibi Netanyahu did his thing, goes, immediately makes a deal with Pfizer. We're going to get 2 million shots. Let's do this. And he does. And we're one of the first countries that gets these vaccinations. And our vaccination rollout was great. Okay, at this point, I mean, we're a tiny country, let's be real. I mean, you guys get it, right? 30 million, what are you, 30 million? We're 9 million, okay? So we've now already vaccinated 3 million people have already gotten the first dose, and 25% of the country has already gotten both doses. So our vaccine rollout has been really, really well done, mainly highlighting the fact that the Israeli healthcare system is actually not broken. It's actually pretty decent, kind of like Canada. You know, people rag on us with socialized medicine. Oh, you have to wait really long for a specialist, this, that. Sure, but everyone is insured. And everyone has like a place where they can go and get the vaccine or sign up for the vaccine. So it's been really positive. But at the same time, the UK variant has made its way into Israel. It's ravaging the ultra-Orthodox community. And because again, they're not listening. They are still opening up their schools, refusing to shut down their schools. And recently, in the last few weeks, what we've seen is the government trying to get them to shut down the schools, and riots have broken out in the streets. They're attacking police officers. A police officer had to literally discharge his weapon just to get people to leave. A bus driver was pulled out of his bus, beaten, and his bus was set on fire. I mean, crazy stuff's been going on because of the ultra-Orthodox refusing to comply with COVID restrictions. And so again, all of these issues are emerging to the surface. But meanwhile, the vaccine's rolling out. Right now, actually, it's lagging. I have to say, I just read a report. The vaccine is lagging. At this point, they vaccinated all the older people, and now people need to sign up and need to go. So now there needs to be more of a promotion, go and get your shot. But we're doing pretty well. But again, the country right now is on lockdown because the UK variant is still keeping those infection numbers high while we're trying to roll out the vaccine. And the biggest fear is that the South Africa variant might make its way into Israel. And if it does, they're concerned that the Pfizer vaccine won't work, even though Pfizer has now come out and said, no, actually, our vaccine will work against the South Africa variant. I don't know, we'll see. What's going on with the Palestinians? Ay vey. Let's talk about this. So we got mixed messages from the PA in the last month. The Palestinian Authority foreign minister came out and said, Israel is responsible for vaccinating the Palestinians. They're the occupying power. And according to the Geneva Conventions, they're responsible. Meanwhile, the rest of the leadership in the PA didn't say anything like that. In fact, Israel asked, do you all need help? Israeli NGOs came and said, do you all need help with vaccines? And they said, no, we're good. We've gone and applied to the WHO, the World Health Organization. We're going to get our own vaccines. We're going to get vaccines from Russia. We're fine. Just make sure to facilitate that they come into the territories. And Israel said, all right, cool, no problem. Then they said, can you help us with our frontline healthcare workers? And we said, we got to work on that. But let me quickly, before I get into it, does Israel have a responsibility to vaccinate Palestinians? According to the Geneva Convention, the answer would be yes. However, in the 1990s, Israel signed an agreement with the Palestinians called the Oslo Accords. It established the Palestinian Authority, and in it, the Palestinian Authority took responsibility for the healthcare of their own people. And so because of that, Israel is not responsible for the healthcare of the Palestinians. Now, again, we shouldn't do anything that would inhibit them from being able to do that. Make sure that, again, if vaccines are delivered into Israel, that they are transferred immediately into the territories, etc. But again, I look at people and I go, how do you think Israel would be able to do this? What do you think? We're going to send the army into Ramallah to vaccinate people? You know, how quickly would the libel emerge that Israel's trying to poison Palestinians with vaccines that are messed up? Like, we're damned if we do, damned if we don't. But I also want to say one more thing. You know, the Palestinian Authority is really interesting. Sometimes they want to be a government. Sometimes they want to be a country, like when they go to the International Criminal Court and they try to bring Israel up on war crime charges. And sometimes they want to be under occupation. And my response is, you can't pick and choose. Because then how is Israel supposed to know how they're supposed to function? Are you under occupation? Are we now beholden to the Geneva Conventions? Or is Oslo our agreement and you're not a country, but you have self-government and you're supposed to be handling these things? That's the question that we need to ask. And it's so frustrating because Israel's stuck in the middle. And again, how are we supposed to know what to do if you keep picking and choosing? I'm a government, I'm not a government. I'm in a government, I'm under occupation. So no, we don't have a responsibility, but we're helping. So now to wrap up, what are we doing? Let's very clearly, so Israel has now already this week delivered 2,000 vaccines. By the end of the week, it's going to be 5,000 total, and that's to vaccinate frontline healthcare workers. 2,500 healthcare workers are receiving those vaccines. Within the next few weeks, Israel is planning on delivering another 20,000 vaccinations to the Palestinians. Meanwhile, the Palestinians, like I said, have already reached out to the WHO, and through a WHO-affiliated organization called COVAX, they are receiving 50,000 more vaccinations. And they're hoping to start their rollout program in the middle of February, so in the next couple of weeks. So that's where they are right now. And I just have to step back and say, you know, it's so hard sometimes because here I am, you know, there's so many real issues going on the ground, and Israel's attacked all the time. But it's just so sad to see that like Israel was getting some good press, right? Oh, look at Israel's vaccination program. It's rolling out really well. This is a positive. And I almost feel like every time that happens, there are people out there who are just anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, who feel the need to like throw a wrench in and then accuse Israel of doing something wrong. And here we now have this libel. It's not that we have a responsibility. It's how you guys aren't vaccinating Palestinians. You hate them. You want them to die. And it's just, as an activist and as an educator, it's just so incredibly frustrating because I genuinely feel like Israel is damned if we do, damned if we don't. We can never get it right when it comes to anti-Israel, the anti-Israel community, the anti-Zionist community, and of course, anti-Semites. So it's not an easy situation, but I think Israel is navigating it pretty well. And we are doing our best to try to help the Palestinians, but they also said, we don't want your help. And the last thing I'll say is, if you're anti-Israel, but more importantly, if you claim to be pro-Palestinian, then why are you infantilizing the Palestinian government? Why are you saying that they're not capable of doing this themselves? Why do you put them in a position where it's Israel's responsibility and they're helpless and weak? Don't you want a Palestinian government that is effective and strong? And here you have a moment where they actually said, you know what, we're good. We can handle this on our own. And instead of bolstering that and saying, wow, that's awesome, you had to subjugate them and push them down and say, no, Israel's responsible. And the Palestinians are poor people living under occupation. It's just so sad. Because how is a Palestinian government ever really going to emerge and be successful if that's the rhetoric that we hear from their own supposed supporters? And that's why I really always ask myself, are they really pro-Palestinian? Do they really care about the Palestinians, or are they just anti-Israel? It's a question we all need to ask ourselves when we face these people. So with that, I'll wrap up and happy to take any questions. I'm sorry I went on a little long, but hopefully we'll all be okay with that extra time. So go ahead, Adam.
Charlotte, kol hakavod. That was awesome. That was like an amazing encapsule of the title and brought it down what's happening with the neighbors around Israel, inside the country itself. Guys, listen, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat for Charlotte. We will go for about 10 minutes max on questions. But while you guys are formulating ones, Charlotte, do you want to take like a minute or two to expand a little bit on some of the craziness in relation to COVID and the rise of anti-Semitism, because as soon as a pandemic like slapped the world, we see like just major like conspiracy theories regarding Jewish, control and all this stuff. Talk a little bit about that and
Sure.
how we can combat that.
I'm going to quote one of my absolute favorite Torah scholars. We just lost him in the last few months. One of the few people we lost in 2020 that absolutely brought me to tears. I'll quote the late Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who, when he talks about anti-Semitism, he talks about it as a virus, which is so incredibly poignant for the time that we are in. And he talks about how the reason why anti-Semitism has survived through generations and over millennia is because it's a virus that mutates. And in every generation, and even in the same generation, sometimes it mutates in a different way, right? We hate the Jews because they're rich. We hate the Jews because they're poor. We hate the Jews because they're isolationists. We hate the Jews because they're assimilationists, right? We hate the Jews because they're deeply religious, or we hate the Jews because they're so grossly cosmopolitan. Like, it just constantly changes. And one of the things that he also points out is that Jews are always really labeled as responsible for the ill of society, right? Scapegoating becomes a core feature of anti-Semitism. And so we've obviously seen this happen, right? As soon as COVID hit, it was very quickly, the conspiracy mills started to turn and started to put out that Israel created this virus, that the Jews are responsible for this virus, that we created it so that we could then create a vaccine and become the saviors of the world. And so, there has been a rise of anti-Semitism in the last year. We're seeing it online. We're seeing it with conspiracy groups in the US, like QAnon or the lizard people. I mean, the fact that I just said lizard people, and this is like a real thing that people believe right now, is like ridiculous. But all of it, so much of it has anti-Semitic roots. And so it's just another mutation of anti-Semitism. But I do want to stress, the UN Secretary General came out saying the other day, anti-Semitism has now risen as a result of the pandemic. But, I got to say, I've been watching anti-Semitism rise for the last 10, almost 11 years that I've been working at Stand With Us. And I was talking about the rise of anti-Semitism well before COVID hit, at least in the last 3 years. So it was already on the rise. Yeah. And then COVID just gave them just another thing to then direct and blame on the Jews. But I don't know if it's COVID. I think genuinely we are getting further and further away from the Holocaust. Holocaust distortion is becoming one of the major problems in the world, not just Holocaust denial, but distortion. The minimization of the Holocaust. Why is the Holocaust a bigger deal than other genocides? Things like that. And all of those things play a role in allowing anti-Semitism to increase in the world and go unchecked. I mean, look at the UK Labour Party. Right? Here you had a leader of the UK Labour Party that 87% of Jews in the UK said was an anti-Semite as far as they were concerned. And, sometimes people say, well, Jews, what do they know about anti-Semitism? Or we should, it's remarkable how, Black people get to describe racism and women get to describe what chauvinism looks like, but Jews are not allowed to define what anti-Semitism looks like. It's mind-boggling. So it's hard, it's sad. And Stand With Us has really emerged as an organization that one of our taglines is now defeating anti-Semitism, fighting against anti-Semitism, which wasn't our tagline when I started this organization. We were about anti-Zionism and Israel education, and now it's also defeating anti-Semitism. And that's because this is a trend that we've seen before COVID. And it's going to continue. And so we need people like you. We need good people around the world who can identify anti-Semitism and really then combat it and fight it wherever it rears its ugly head, if you will. So right. I'm so glad you all are here and that you do this, because we need all the help that we can get.
Absolutely, Charlotte. Well, we so appreciate that. One for sure thing is that Stand With Us and ICJ, where Stand With Us is a primarily Jewish organization, ICJ is a Christian organization, but the goals are the same in the fact that we stand against anti-Semitism in all its forms. And please follow us on social media. Some of you are already following ICJ, but follow Stand With Us, follow Charlotte. There's so much you could learn. Stand With Us, their Instagram account is like top level cool. Like there's even, news updates and stuff like that. So I really encourage you guys to do that. A couple questions that came in One is really, it's a comment because I know Jory, this is what Jory hears, because Jory is in the issue. She's at UBC, and now she's even going to an Ivy League school soon, I believe. But she gets this question a lot. Why is the Holocaust a bigger deal than other genocides? If you can put that in a nutshell. I don't know if you can.
And here she's saying, like, I've heard this a lot, but, and maybe not a question, but I think it is. I think what people, oftentimes what we hear is not just, why is it a bigger deal? Oh, it's a bigger deal because it was against white people. Have you ever heard that? Right. And when it happened in Rwanda, well, it was Black people, so nobody cares. Right. Or when it happened in Cambodia, it was, darker people, so who cares? But because the Holocaust was against white people, everyone seems to care. I have to be very clear. And my answer to this to somebody would be very clear. The Jews were killed in Europe because we weren't white. Right. It was the Aryan race that killed us because, as far as they were concerned, we were not white in any way, shape, or form. And this is one of the hardest things as a Jewish person is, here I am, look at me. Like, how can I stand in front of somebody and be like, I'm not white. I'm the daughter of two converts. My roots are Irish and Italian, but my real roots are Judean. And, that's hard to explain to somebody when you have to say, listen, Jews are European, Middle Eastern, South American, and everything in between, but we're not. We're Judean. Our origins are in that land. We are indigenous to that land. We only look the way that we do today because we've lived in exile for over 2,000 years and we adapted to our surroundings. But ultimately, it's so ironic because for 1,800 years, it was the rest of the world that made it very clear to us that we were not welcome in these places, that we weren't these people, that we were foreign. And they always said to us, go back to Palestine. And so we did. They knew that that was home for us. But now it's, now you guys are white colonial settlers who stole this land from the native Palestinians. And you're just like, again, damned if we do, damned if we don't. Watch anti-Semitism mutate. And so, again, they do this to, one, try to say that Jews are white, and two, try to just minimize it, push it aside. It's not that important. It's not more important than other genocides. And you know what I would have to say to people? What I'll say to all of you is, we always see that what starts with the Jews never ends with the Jews. Mm-hmm. And if you're in another minority group, you should know that oftentimes you're next in line. We, the Jews, joke that we're the canary in the mine shaft, right? We're the canary that's going to start to tweet that says, oh, there's gas, get out of here. And what is that? That gas is the vile anti-Semitism that eventually is going to spread to other communities. Right. And so when you start to see anti-Semitism in the world, but in your community in particular, just know that that is a toxin that is going to spread. And so, it's not me just saying, defend the Jews. You should. I think you should defend anyone who's under threat, who's being persecuted or threatened, but know that it's not going to end with us. Yeah. And when it rears its ugly head, it says it's so much more a message or a signal of what is happening within your own society. And that's my biggest fear about the United States today, is I feel on both sides, the progressive left, the far right, anti-Semitism it exists. And not only does it exist, but it's not being marginalized. Right. It's more and more being brought into the fold with people like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. And then on the right, you have, I don't remember his name, but the guy in the wheelchair who's from North Carolina, who's a white supremacist. You have Marjorie Taylor Greene, the blonde who believes in QAnon, who said that a Jewish laser, she said this last week, that yes, a Jewish space laser causes forest fires. And this woman was put in the House of Representatives, was put on the Education Committee of the House of Representatives. Not marginalized, not allowed to not join committees, but in fact, bolstered by the minority leader, Kevin McCarthy. So, and I'm sorry I'm talking American politics, but that's just, I'm here now, and so I'm immersed in it. But when that happens, really those alarm bells should be going off for everybody, Absolutely, not just for us. So it's really sad. It's very hard. And that's what I would say to them if I was answering the question. This wasn't just any genocide. This was mass-produced, manufactured murder. Industrial murder on a scale that we had never seen before in history.
Absolutely. So. Absolutely. Wow, Charlotte. Well, thank you so much. There's so much that you just unpacked for us. Good thing, guys, it is recorded and it's live on Facebook. So if you need to go back and to hear it again, it's there for you. So I encourage you all to do that. Go ahead, Charlotte.
I just want to add, I put my, my email address and my Instagram handle in the chat box. So I just want to stress, like, you can always feel free to email me, send me a DM, asking me any questions. If something comes up and you see a claim against Israel and you just need kind of like a quick, is this true? What's going on? I'm really here as a resource. And then, like Adam said, the organization that supports me, stands behind me, allows me to do this work every day is Stand With Us. And they also are an amazing, amazing resource on Facebook, on Instagram, on all the platforms. They're on TikTok. I mean, they're everywhere. I'm not even in most of those platforms. So follow Stand With Us. I'm not telling you to follow me, but just, I am a resource for you. And I'm always here if you ever have any more questions or want to follow up. So I just want to thank you so much. And I just want to thank ICJ, because I just so appreciate this partnership that we've had for so many years. And I really, really look forward to having y'all in Israel again this summer. And I hope to see you all there. So just thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And thank you to Adam, who's just allowed this partnership to continue to grow and flourish over the years. So thank you so much. And Philippe, and I don't see your full name, but Mar something, sorry. Marissa, congratulations on your new role, and I'm sure you'll do great. So thank you all so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Charlotte. Listen, there's so many, the last question was totally has nothing to do with the real stuff, but maybe in one small or two sentences, Charlotte, is how can we pray for you? There's a pray for you and pray for Israel. We're people of faith, just like you are a person of faith. If you could put that in like a nutshell, what are like one or two things that Christians in Canada can pray for Israel and even yourself? Oh, I'm unmuting you. Here we go.
Sorry, I muted myself, not realizing that I wouldn't be able to unmute myself. This is such an interesting question as an Orthodox Jew. I mean, I was always told, pray in whatever way you can. Pray, there's legitimate prayers that we read, in our services about Israel and about, protecting people. But I also just think just talking straight to your Lord, God, and just saying what you feel. I think that's what it comes down to, is praying for the Jewish people, praying for the wider world, praying for Christians around the world who are also being persecuted, but also prayers that Israel remains a place where, Jews, Christians, Muslims, and other religions alike can all come and worship freely and practice freely, and that none of those populations are persecuted in Israel or around the world. So that's it. You don't need to pray for me personally, but the Jewish people, we need it. We need it as much as you can give it. So it's as simple as that.
Well, whether you're like it or not, we're praying for you because you have a voice to use, and we really appreciate you, Charlotte, 100%, and the work that is going down with Stand With Us. It's so important, guys. So again, we're just going to wrap up here in just a moment. I want to give you guys just a really cool 3-minute video of what the ICEJ is doing in Israel right now, what we did last year during the Corona. And then we're going to just say quick goodbye. If you do need to go, Charlotte, we bless you. We'll be in touch. Thank you so much. Toda rabba. And you guys enjoy this quick little vid of what's going down. Oh, I shared my whole screen. Hold on one sec. There we go.
Hundreds dead, thousands infected across multiple continents.
It's a thin line that divides East from West Jerusalem, but viruses know no borders.
We have therefore made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
The year 2020 has indeed been one of the most challenging years around the world. While the year started well, with Israel leading the way in the battle against the coronavirus, the second half of the year Israel was challenged with one of the highest infection rates around the world. Nevertheless, in this year of crisis, the Lord opened amazing opportunities to bless the Jewish people like never before. Whether it was to bring them back to their homeland or to unite believers from around the world in prayer for Israel, or even to celebrate the largest Feast of Tabernacles, you have been with us in this critical time. Now let's have a look what the Lord did through the ICEJ in 2020.
When travel became far more challenging or was halted completely, the ICEJ was still able to help fulfill biblical prophecy through Aliyah. In fact, Aliyah did not decrease, but only increased as we welcomed 1,475 new Jewish immigrants home to Israel from across the globe. While so many were isolated in their homes during seasons of lockdown, the ICEJ was still able to meet critical needs. This year, as we partnered with you, we helped provide 55,000 meals, 2,500 essential packages and items, and more than 100 computers for distance education. Holocaust survivors represented one of the most vulnerable groups during the pandemic, but the residents of the Haifa home were in good hands as staff worked to make sure they had food, essential supplies, and encouragement. For these residents, the encouragement from volunteers became very important, as it was the only personal contact they had while staying safe at home. As each of you personally faced the global pandemic, the ICEJ was able to host regular online prayer gatherings that blessed and connected many people around the world. The coronavirus threatened to cancel the Feast of Tabernacles celebration this year, but with God's help, we were able to impact more people than ever before as we connected with over 100 nations for the first ever online feast celebration.
This year we have seen that God's word never fails. Even in the midst of this crisis year, God continued to bring his people back to their homeland. And he will continue to protect and to provide for them. But also for each one of us, as this new year starts, he will be faithful to each one of our needs. And no matter what challenges or changes 2021 might bring to us, we know the one whose word and character never changes. And we all want to invite you to stand with us as we continue to be your embassy right here in Jerusalem.